The Roman Empire was disintegrating. Ravaged by wave after wave of barbarian tribes from the east. Rome, an old capital, dying a slow death. But its influence on the Celtic lands was far-reaching and profound. Gaul had been conquered, its people progressively Romanized. The Celts here had adopted the language of their conquerors, their lifestyle, their art, and their religions. Their warriors now fought with Rome, not against it. But one part of Gaul retained a Celtic independence, of sorts. The peninsula of Brittany. Here, elements of the original Celticity of mainland Europe survived. It survived to our day, showing the incredible tenacity of a people determined to walk their own peculiar ways. The Britons, wrote the Roman governor Agricola, were gradually led on to the amenities which make vice agreeable: arcades, baths, and sumptuous banquets. This is Bath, a Roman centre, a town on the edge of Britain's lowland zone, where the language of Latin was the language of power. This lowland zone was the region of the villae, the country houses, like Fishbourne. Roman in style and comfort, centres of landed estates, their owners fluent and literate in Latin. But their fields were worked by locals, Celts. And it would be apparent to them that power, wealth, comfort belonged to those who embraced Romanitas. Rome ruled by the sword, and Britain was largely a military zone. Caerleon, Isca, with its second legion of over 5,000 men. These are their garrisons. None of the soldiers were from the local population. Under Roman rule, that was forbidden. They were foreigners, some probably German, unwelcomed guests. Elsewhere in Britain's highland zone, Celtic communities lived on, still established in their hill forts. Some, as here in North Wales, overlooking the Roman garrison on the plain. This is Caernarvon, the Roman Saguntium. From here, one Celtic hero rose up to charge on Rome itself and declare himself emperor. To the Welsh, he's a mythical hero, Maxen Wledig, the founder of the Welsh nation. He's still honoured in song. But the truth behind the myth is rather different.
He was a Spanish soldier who was sent to fight the Irish and Picts in Britain in the 80s of the 4th century. His success went to his head, and before long he went with his soldiers back to the continent to slay the Roman emperor, Gratianus, and to declare himself emperor, and there he was for 5 years until he lost his own head. So not a romantic figure at all, but one typical of the period.
And that period was marked by instability and warring. The Highland zone of Britain was not Romanized. This is the most famous wall in Britain, built by the Emperor Hadrian. It marked the edge of the military zone. Beyond it, in Roman eyes, the territory of the barbarians. In reality, there were here powerful Celtic kingdoms. Carlisle was the centre of one, Rheged, then spanning the wall from Cumbria to southwest Scotland. Others were to use it as their centre too. Dominating the Clyde Valley, another capital, Dumbarton, the seemingly impregnable centre of Ystrad Clede, Strathclyde. It dominated the surrounding countryside. Its rulers dominated the surrounding peoples. Gwir y Gogledd, the Welsh of the north. And then Dinedin, Edinburgh, the capital of the mighty Gododdin. These were the Welsh-speaking kingdoms of the north, their history ignored by the English and the Celtic Anglophiles, who in their own image idolized Rome and the Empire. Beyond Hadrian's wall, another wall had been built by Antonine. It marked the total limit of civilization. To most, it's little known. It hasn't the romance of Hadrian's construction. But beyond it lay the untouched land of the Picts. One of the most mysterious peoples of Europe. We know that this was their realm, that they probably spoke a language akin to Old Welsh, but even their name is a mystery.
We don't have the Picts' own name for themselves. We don't know what their own ethnic name was called. In terms of what their neighbours called them, to the south, people speaking Welsh called them Prydain. Prydain meant the Picts or Pictland, and that's the same word that's given us Britain. So as far as the people to the south were concerned, they were a kind of Britain, a northern Britain. And the people in Ireland called them Cruithne or Cruni, and that goes back to the same root, meaning Britain. People writing in Latin called them Picti, which means painted people. Whether this was because they actually were painted or tattooed, we don't know. It might be just a form of their own word for themselves. There's, after all, a Gaulish tribe from the Iron Age called the Pictones, which is a Celtic word, so maybe there's a connection there. Maybe they did paint themselves. I mean, there is some evidence that in the earlier period, Britons had painted themselves with woad or tattooed themselves. Maybe not all the time, maybe just going into battle.
And battle was something with which the Picts became very familiar. So many of their relics are pictures of battles. Others remain a mystery, but we know that the very removal of Roman authority to the south left a vacuum which the Picts exploited. But northern Britain had yet another kingdom. It lay well beyond the influence of Rome, but not beyond the influence of Ireland. It was called Dalriada and covered that zone where the British mainland is closest to the Isle of Ireland. Spanning the narrow divide between the two, it formed a natural unit with the Irish of the north. Initially small, its peoples were to have a profound influence on the history of Scotland and of Britain. Its cross-channel neighbour Ireland also lay beyond the rule of Rome. Here, Roman influences did not disrupt the Celtic way of life. The social structures remained intact. The High Kings still came to their kingdoms here, the royal capital, the sacred hill of Tara. The departure of the last Roman legions from Britain left an unprotected country, open to raiding and to conquest by the Celtic tribes of Ireland. They poured, largely unopposed, across the Irish Sea. Wales was severely under attack, but help came from the fellow Cymry of the north. Out of Stirling marched Cinedda, his sons and his armies. They settled here in the hill fort of Duganoy, overlooking the River Conwy. From here, they smashed into the Irish invaders, gradually driving them out of North Wales. But Cinedda is a figure of the Dark Ages. His campaigns, part fact, part fiction. There's some doubt even about the dates of his campaigns.
If this happened late in the 4th century, perhaps he was moved as part of the Roman policy of using one lot of barbarians, Britons in this case, against another lot, Irish, the Irish in Wales. If it happened rather later, after the Romans left, it may be one more episode in the civil wars that ensued after the Romans left Britain, rather similar to what's happened in Yugoslavia after the fall of the Russian Empire.
Despite the violence of civil war, the Romans had left behind the notion of a British kingdom. Who now would succeed to the crown of that kingdom? In the lowland zone, peacekeeping had been the preserve of the Romans. The natives had forgotten how to fight. The leaders of the highland zone had not. This was the cradle of the new warriors, and chief among them, Vortigern. Erupting out of the Welsh borderlands, he swept to power, but brought upon his head the vicious criticism and scorn of the monk historian Gildas.
Tum omnes conciliarii, una cum superbo tyranno caecanto, ad inveniantes tali presidium, immo excidium patriae, ut ferocissime, illi nefandi nominis Saxones.
At first, there seemed to be no danger at all, as just 3 Saxon longships crossed the North Sea to land on the coast of Kent.
The problem which Vortigern faced was that the old Roman province of Britain was, after the Romans had left, unable to resist and repulse the attacks particularly of the Picts from the north. They appealed twice to the Romans, according to Gildas, and they were helped on both occasions. But the third time they appealed to the Romans for help, they were refused that help. So the council of the kings of the British province, under Vortigern's supervision, decided to invite the Anglo-Saxons in as mercenaries in order to help repulse the Picts. And they were to do this in exchange for their maintenance. And that was the first deal.
No spot can be sacred to the English as the spot which first felt the tread of English feet. The words of a reputable 19th century historian. But Hengest and his brother Horsa were German, not English at all.
Hengist, the leader of the English war band, brought with him his daughter, and Vortigern saw her and fell in love with her. So he concluded a bargain with Hengist that he should have his daughter and Hengist should have the kingdom of Kent.
It was not the last time for a Celt to be led astray by the blonde tresses of a Saxon lass. But Vortigern had yielded rich lands to the Saxons. It whetted their appetite for more.
The relationship between Vortigern and Hengist culminated in what is known as the treachery of the Long Knives. And the story goes that a feast was arranged in which 300 of the British nobles and 300 of the Anglo-Saxon leaders were invited. And at a prearranged signal by Hengist, the Anglo-Saxons drew their daggers and stabbed their opposite numbers. After that incident, the Anglo-Saxons finally turned upon their British hosts, and they gradually occupied most of the island. That was the end point of the story.
The story, like many of the period, may be myth, but it might as well be true. Saxons would now inherit the land. Out of the rubble of history, giants emerge. But of one, Arthur, there is but mystery. Yet his name appears everywhere. In Edinburgh, Arthur's seat. In Brittany, too, there are scores of references to him. He rode and hunted here in the Brocéliande forest. And in this forest, a magical oak tree still stands, Merlin's oak. Some Bretons today believe in its power and deposit their written wishes beneath its branches. The Cornish claim Arthur, his court, the promontory fort of Tintagel. Recently, this stone was discovered near the site and marked on it the very name, Arthur. Proof, say some, of his close association with this part of the world. He's associated too with Glastonbury, the mystical Avalon. But the Dark Ages are often precisely that, and of the Arthur story, there is not one contemporary reference. All the sources are of a later date, sometimes centuries later. The Latin History of the Britons, disputably by the monk Nennius, refers to the Saxons. It refers to the Britons, of course, and purports to trace their history. And in that history, Arthur has his place, but the account is from the 9th century. The Black Book of Carmarthen contains some of the oldest poems, myths, and legends in Welsh. Arthur's appearance here belongs precisely to that world of myth. the magical Welsh tales of the Mabinogi, written again centuries after the age of Arthur, are rooted in an age where the oral tradition was strong, and Arthur pervades this world.
Now, the earliest Arthurian tale we have is Culhwch ag Olwen, and this is a tale about Culhwch. His stepmother places a curse on him that he shall marry no one save Olwen, the daughter of Ysbyddaden, chief giant. But with the help of Arthur and his men, then Culhwch gets his girl. We don't really know if Arthur was a historical character. Had he lived, then he probably lived around the year 500 and would perhaps have fought against the English. Now, what's interesting in Culhwch ag Olwen, there's no mention of realistic enemies at all. Arthur fights against witches and against giants, and finally in the tale against the wild boar, the Twrch Trwyth, which he chases from Ireland all the way over to Wales.
This constant fascination with Arthur in Celtic folklore, in the numerous sites linked with him, may well point back to a real figure. We know that towards the end of the 5th century, the Saxon advance was stopped in its tracks. The historian Gildas records a British victory at a site called Baden Hill. Could it be Arthur who led this campaign? Perhaps he did. Perhaps he was the leader of the mobile cavalrymen fighting the length and breadth of the kingdom. Certainly in the first half of the 6th century, the Saxons were checked. The British seem to have turned the tide. In Cambridgeshire, there is direct evidence of resistance. A 7-mile-long bank and ditch, named appropriately the Devil's Dyke. It segregated the Saxons and the British. To the west of it, the British. To the east, the Saxons. And here, Saxon remains have been discovered. This particular character died in battle. Archaeologists believe him to have been a chief. Date of death, about 550 AD, the very period of British success. Six foot tall, strong, sturdy, and even in death, warlike. The experts have been able to reconstruct his appearance. A true representative of the Saxon people, a people now firmly established on British soil. Their early success, many argue, was due to better military equipment and a grim determination to succeed. But, just at the very time the British seemed to be reversing their fortunes, disaster struck. The bubonic plague. It ripped the heart out of the British population. Thousands upon thousands perished. The disease was strangely more virulent amongst the Britons than the Saxons, who suffered comparatively little. The plague emanated from the Mediterranean, and the Celts had maintained strong trading and cultural links with that area. Perhaps that explains matters. But whatever the cause, the result was disastrous. Before the plague, Arthur, if he existed, had gained a respite for the native British. But that's all it was, a respite. After 50 years of peace, the Saxons came surging back, always targeting the most fertile lands. What followed was a formative period in the history of the Isles. A Germanic base was established on which eventually an English nation would be built. The Saxons lived in their nucleated villages alongside the existing British, rarely with them. It was still a dominantly rural economy, but there were changes in the air. Culturally, the two peoples were different, and those differences became ingrained, permanent. From the outset, the Celtic language Welsh and the new language English were divided, and the native tongue was the one that suffered.
It died out in the lowland areas for two main reasons. First, it's the language of the defeated, the people who lack prestige, who lack political power. The second reason is because English becomes a mark of the political identity of a people, because national identity is very strongly linguistic. So, if you want to get on, if you want to belong, as it were, to the people who now control things, you've got to change to speaking English. It's very striking how few Welsh or British words were ever borrowed into English, because there must have been centuries, indeed, I mean, if you take it right down to the modern period, millennia in which there are bilingual people, there's a frontier where there's mixture between Welsh speakers and English speakers. But the number of loan words into English is only around about 10, which is an amazingly small number. And that is usually explained because the political dominant group who regard themselves as English because they speak English, they're not going to use Welsh words because it will mark them out as belonging to the defeated.
It might have been different. From Rheged, the Celtic kingdom astride the Solway Firth, erupted a great leader, Urien. His exploits were extolled by the poet Taliesin. Writing in early Welsh, he praises Urien's achievements. Death and grief were suffered by the English. Burnt are their bones, bare their bodies. Urien routed the invaders at their Northumbrian centre, Lindisfarne. But at Lindisfarne too, Urien met his end, betrayed by one of his own kind. And so the Anglo-Saxon advance continued into the lowlands of Scotland. Had Urien lived, who knows how different Britain would be today, where now would be the English border. Urien, like Arthur, put a brake on the advance. He did not halt it. Lowland Scotland passed into the ever-expanding orbit of the English. Resistance then came from Edinburgh, centre of the kingdom of the Gododin. Leaders from the Celtic tribes gathered here, 300 of them, from the north of England and from Wales, a gathering of the Cymry. In the hall of the king of the Gododin, they feasted for a round year. The bards sang of past deeds of bravery, of victories, raising the spirits for a last-ditch attack to drive out the arrogant usurpers. Eventually, they move south to face the enemy. Ironically, this is where the opposing forces met. In our century, it's a military camp, Catterick. In the language of the Cymry, Catraeth, a name with colossal overtones. The battle was a massacre. Vastly outnumbered, the British had failed. The bones of their heroes picked clean by the rooks and ravens. The bard Aneurin was a lone survivor. His epic poem describes the scenes, the feasting, the bravery, the valor, and the defeat of the 300 who marched on Catraeth. Taliesin and Aneurin composed Europe's oldest literature, written in Welsh by bards from Scotland about events in England. But that was before such nations existed. The massacre at Catraeth marked the beginning of the end of the Gododdin. Its capital, the capital of the future Scotland, was now de-Celticized and Anglicized. This would have a profound effect upon the nation's future. In the west, Dalriada, different problems, but with equally profound consequences. Peoples from Ireland were settling here, plunderers, pirates, the Scotti. At Dinard Hillfort was sited their Hill of Tara. Here, so legend has it, on this spot, the future king stood. From here, he was anointed. An energetic people, they brought a new language, the Q branch of the Celtic family, Gaelic. Eventually, under Kenneth MacAlpin and his descendants, the Gaels of Dalriada and the Picts of the North were united. A new nation was emerging, its capital, Edinburgh, the centre of the old Welsh kingdom of Gododdin. Here are housed the outward symbols of a nation, the crown and sceptre. Here also a sacred stone, the stone of destiny, the stone of Scone on which kings are inaugurated. Steal this, and you cannot then inaugurate kings. But no one had thought of doing that, yet. This was a nation in embryo, forged of Gaels, Picts, Cymry, and now the English. To the south, the Saxon advance continued unabated. The native Britons were subjugated and slowly strangled out of existence. Some moved south to Cornwall and Brittany, others westwards to join their fellow Cymry in the land that came to be called Wales. And dividing the two peoples, this dyke was built by Offa, the very first king to call himself King of the English. And Wales, the Welsh? The term wall means foreigners. The dyke is nothing other than an attempt to firmly separate two peoples impossible to unite. It is a line of apartheid. The Welsh were now strangers in their own land. No one knows how or when Christianity came to the Celtic world. The vast majority of Celtic peoples held the old religious beliefs stretching back to the Iron Age, when Patrick made his attack on the pagan world of Ireland. He lit the Paschal fire in full view of the Hill of Tara, where the Council of the High King was meeting. He lit it here on the Hill of Slane, and dared the pagans to do their worst. They failed, of course. When Patrick died, aged 120, Christianity had taken root.
When Patrick arrives, whenever he arrives, let's say sometime in the 5th century, he's doing something that no Roman cleric has ever done before. He's taking the Christian message beyond the limits of the Roman Empire. And that's what makes Patrick unique. Irrespective of whether you regard Patrick as being the person who brought Christianity or not, that doesn't matter. He has such a strong tradition in Ireland that's established anyway. But the fact that he brought Christianity to a people that had never known it before and that had never been part of the Roman Empire is in itself something quite unique. And it's because of their difference, it's because of the fact that they were never in the empire, that the later Irish church is peculiar, because the way Irish people do things is the way they had done things before, just with a slight twist for the purposes of Christianity. In other words, Christianity is added as a sort of superstructure or veneer on top of the way that Irish people did things before that.
Patrick's work was evangelical. Others sought salvation as hermits. They found their inspiration in the south, the desert lands of Egypt. Here, Christian monks fled the distractions and temptations of the city. Their lives of solitude, meditation, and fasting became heroic models. Many bonded together to form monasteries. Monasteries where monks abandoned everything in their search for God. Here they lived their simple lives of prayer and service. The Celtic saints would follow their example, and the sea became a fitting substitute for the inhospitable desert. Rocky islands were occupied by men and women called from the world to live as monks and nuns, desiring separate and radical lives of prayer. Others settled on the coast, solitude and remoteness their hallmarks. Around their lives, legends inevitably grew. A cleft in the rock opened up by God. A miracle that gave St. Govan safe sanctuary from the pirates of the high seas. The forerunner of this ascetic Celtic church was Ninian. He sought refuge at Whithorn on the Galloway coast of Scotland. Born of wealthy noble parents, he abandoned all for the life of a hermit monk. Pilgrims still come here. Here they pray and leave their tokens. It is said that as a young man, Ninian made a pilgrimage to Rome, and there was made a bishop by the Pope. His fame spread, and before long he established a monastery and a school which Patrick himself may well have visited. He set a pattern, and the developments at Whithorn were matched elsewhere. In Wales, St Illtyd rose to prominence, his centre at Llantwit Major in the Vale of Glamorgan, a veritable university. It spawned great leaders who, in their turn, copied their master's ways. One travelled to West Wales. He came face to face with a pagan Irish king whose nubile women frolicked naked in the river to lure the saint. The temptations of the flesh were as nothing. The pagan king disappeared in a puff of smoke. The saint established his centre. It's still here today, St. David's. The patron saint of the Welsh. Miraculously born, he caused the ground to rise so others could hear him preach. His sermon, Remember the Little Things. A sermon conveniently forgotten by succeeding generations. St. David's is now a remote cathedral on the west coast. The city, the smallest in Britain. But it was not always so. The Irish Sea was a major thoroughfare. The Celtic saints made full use of it as another of Illtyd's pupils sailed south to Brittany. St. Sampson's Church now marks the spot where he too established a thriving monastic centre. These Celtic churches shared a large measure of unity in their religious and cultural life. But St. Sampson, like the others, was impeccably orthodox in his beliefs. They had no preoccupations with doctrinal issues. The Trinity was the Trinity. St. Sampson, a servant of the Church. But on the continent, that church had slumped into a truly dark age. The Celtic Church was alive and vibrant. Centres of learning became commonplace. A literate elite flocked here, releasing energies that bore fruit in every branch of religious and secular life. Here, poetry, literature, history, and the writing of the early Christian fathers were studied and stored. Celtic monks and monasteries retained what was being lost on a continent overrun by barbarians. They studied and they copied. The rich and elaborate illuminations of manuscripts like the Book of Kells, a wondrous contrast to the austere and simple lives of the monks who wrote them. Orthodox they may have been, but they had developed their own idiosyncrasies. In calculating the greatest of all the Christian festivals, Easter, Rome and Ireland were at odds.
Rome, generally speaking, went nuclear when it heard about the Irish way of doing things. That's to say, we know that from a very early date, that's to say in terms of Columbanus, he was accused already by about 600 by Frankish bishops of being heretical. He was called to a synod. He was told to come and explain himself. He realized that they were ganging up on him, so to speak. So he beat them to the punch. He took a sort of preemptive strike against them and went directly to Rome. And he wrote the first of his letters, his most famous letter, the first letter to Gregory the Great, or Gregory the First, is addressed precisely to that subject of Easter. But it's a remarkable document because Columbanus more or less lays it on the line to the Pope and says, look, you are recommending this table of yours to us. We have tried it at home. We've looked at this. Our mathematicians have been through it, and it's wrong. It's crazy. It doesn't work. So we're sticking to our table, and if you have any sense, you'll do the same. You'll follow ours. Now, it's a very striking document because it shows a degree of self-sufficiency and confidence which you don't, for example, expect of the Catholic Church in this country nowadays, for example. Unfortunately, we know of no reply. The letter almost certainly arrived in Rome, but either because it was so extraordinarily forthright and so on, Either the Pope didn't reply at all or the reply is lost. But we do know that for some years after that, the Irish did persist in their ways of calculating Easter according to their Easter table, and the Continentals did it their way.
Great monastic centres like Clonmacnoise showed another Celtic twist on things. Here, a church organised under the episcopal structure common in the Mediterranean world was impossible. The tribal organisation of society was too ingrained to accept the Roman model. Monastic life was conceived as part of a penitential wandering or pilgrimage for Christ. Remoteness and hardship were of the essence. Nowhere is this seen more starkly than in Iona, on the western edge of the Isle of Mull. It's still a centre of pilgrimage. It was established by St. Columba, the dove of the church. He required that the monks here lived only for God, praying constantly, owning no luxuries, eating only when hungry, sleeping only when tired. Irish by birth, from Iona, Columba converted the Scotti of Dalriada and prepared the way for the conversion of the Picts. From Iona too came a band of monks bent on converting the English of Northumbria. They settled here at Lindisfarne. Wooden stakes are still in place to lead the pilgrims of today along the causeway to the Holy Isle. The leader was Aidan. Others had gone before from Iona and failed, describing the English as an obstinate, barbarous people. Aidan succeeded. The monks thrived, and their monastery became the cradle of Christianity amongst the English of the north. But Christianity came too from the south. These monks are in the orders of a Roman saint, Pope Gregory, aptly named the Great. He too wrought miracles. Canterbury Cathedral is witness to his success. Gregory planned a concentrated campaign to convert the English. It was led by Augustine, a rigid, unimaginative man. At least he had the good sense to seek guidance from Gregory, whose letters show flexibility towards the native pagans. Augustine listened, learned, and converted the English by their thousands. Added to Gregory's good advice was practical support. Clerics, scholars, singers, even the Pope's own choir master was sent to make this a truly Roman church. A clash with the wayward Celtic Church of the West was inevitable. The Roman Church became inextricably tied to the more powerful English. The ruins of Whitby Abbey mark the ruins of the Celtic Church. This abbey was built at the place where the synod met in 664, a synod that accepted the Roman calendar and a centralized Roman structure. The seed of Romanitas planted by the Pope eventually overcame the Celtic Church of the West. Even in religion, Celticism was on the retreat.